What would you do if your family treated you like a favor with legs? 4 days, she said. Just feed him, walk him, maybe fluff the couch cushions. She didn't ask. She scheduled me. They called it a favor. But we know what it really was. And I was done being that person who everyone expects to not deserve a slice of happiness. So, I did what no one expected any reasonable, 71-year-old woman with a bit of a savings account, a working passport, and a poodle named Henry would do. I booked a flight to St. Barts. For two. One for me, one for Henry, and vanished without a trace. If you've ever been taken for granted, keep watching. Because what began as dog-sitting turned into the best decision of my life. Tell me in the comments, where would you go if no one could stop you? Ensure you hit the subscribe button if you've ever been written off. Because trust me, they never saw this coming. This isn't a story about dogs or beaches. It's about being invisible. It's about what happens when a woman stops waiting to be noticed and starts living like she matters. The thing about being helpful is that people stop asking if you're willing. They just assume you are. Especially when you're a woman. Especially when you're older. And especially when the people asking call you mom with just enough sugar in their voice to coat the manipulation. I was eating oatmeal when the text came in. Hey mom, any chance you could take Henry for a few days? We're heading to Turks and Caicos. Just us four. Family time. I stared at the screen for a moment. Not the emojis, not the word Henry, the phrase that stung like vinegar in a paper cut. Just us four. Family time. As though I didn't count. As though I hadn't been family since the last time I baked a birthday cake or bought them a winter coat. It took me 6 minutes to respond. Of course, happy to help. And I meant it, or thought I did. That's the part that gets you. The lie you tell yourself. It's just a dog, just a few days, just being useful. They dropped Henry off 2 days later. No time for coffee. My daughter Allison stood in the foyer, phone in one hand, keys in the other. She kissed my cheek without eye contact. You're amazing. Seriously. You always come through. She always said it like that. Like I was a really dependable piece of furniture. Like I was the coat hook by the door, or the drawer that always had extra batteries. Henry looked at me with big brown eyes like he already knew he was in better hands. They left me a handwritten note. Allison always thought that made her more thoughtful. Feeding instructions, favorite toys, vet info, oh, and he sleeps with his lamb chop plush. He gets anxious without it. Love you, Mom. You're the best. Then they were gone. I stood in the hallway holding a duffel bag full of gourmet kibble, dental chews, and a monogrammed raincoat. I don't even own a raincoat. The first night was fine. Henry curled up on the couch next to me like a gentleman. We watched an old movie. He licked my hand every time I sighed too hard. The second night, he wouldn't eat the kibble. He sniffed it, then walked away with the kind of disdain only the rich or the pampered know how to express. By night 3, he had claimed my bed. I was sleeping like a guest in my own home, while my family sent photos of beach sunsets and margaritas. My granddaughter Lila posted a selfie on Instagram with the caption, "Family first." I wasn't tagged. That was the moment. The moment something broke. Or maybe it wasn't a break. Maybe it was a clean snap, like a frozen branch deciding it had bent far enough. I opened my laptop, typed in direct flights from Seattle, and then stopped. I looked at Henry. He stared back, paws tucked under like a loaf of bread. I whispered, "How do you feel about sand, darling?" An hour later, we had tickets to St. Barts. Not Florida, not Santa Monica. Number I wanted turquoise water and linen napkins and concierge service. I wanted a place so far removed from Allison's plans that she'd have to squint at a map to even figure out where I went. Henry, as it turned out, had a valid pet passport. Allison had gotten it years ago for a trip that never happened. I found it in the duffel bag. Of course she had one. Of course she'd never thought I'd use it. The next morning, I left a note. Henry and I are on vacation. Don't worry, we'll be back when we feel like it. Love, Mom. I packed 2 swimsuits, 1 sun hat, and my late husband's sunglasses. Not because I needed them, because I wanted to remember who I was before I became someone's emergency contact. At the airport, the woman at check-in looked down at Henry's carrier and then at me. Is he emotional support? I smiled. No, darling, I am his. And just like that, we boarded, me and the dog, flying first class to freedom. The plane took off with a quiet roar, and for the first time in what felt like decades, I wasn't going anywhere for anyone but myself. I watched the suburbs of Seattle shrink below us, clusters of roofs and driveways stitched together like a patchwork quilt of monotony. Somewhere down there, Allison would be waking up to realize her lifesaver had packed up and vanished. I imagined the confusion, the disbelief, the rising tide of entitlement. I could almost hear her voice, sharp and urgent, barking into her phone. She what? She took the dog? Yes, dear. Yes, I did. Henry was nestled under the seat in his carrier, silent and noble, like he too understood the rebellion we'd just committed. Occasionally, I reached down to stroke his ears, soft and warm, and every time I did, my heart relaxed a little more. I didn't sleep on the flight. I didn't read. I just sat still, something I hadn't done in years without guilt snapping at my heels. No casseroles to make, no plants to water, no text notifications asking if I could just swing by or quickly watch the kids. I was unreachable now, 30,000 feet above the expectations that had anchored me for too long. We landed in Barts just before sunset. The heat kissed my skin like an old friend, and the air smelled like salt, sugar, and something slightly decadent, rum maybe, or freedom. A young man in linen slacks greeted us at the airport. His name was Luke, and he held a sign that said, Ms. Fielding plus companion. I burst out laughing. Henry wagged his tail. The drive to the villa was winding and full of bougainvillea, bright fuchsia tumbling over white stone walls like they didn't know how to be anything but joyful. Luke talked the whole way, about the island, the villa, the chef who would be making my dinner that evening. I nodded, smiled, said little. My voice still felt like it belonged to someone else. But my silence wasn't exhaustion. It was awe. The villa was perched on a hill overlooking the bay. A private pool, a long deck with wicker chairs, and a breeze that felt curated. Inside, the air conditioning whispered quietly, and a bowl of fresh mangoes sat on the counter like a welcome home gift from the universe. I let Henry roam. He sniffed every corner, gave the infinity pool a skeptical glance, then plopped down on the sun-soaked tile like he'd lived there his entire life. I changed into my linen dress, the one I hadn't worn since Richard's retirement party. It still fit, tightly in the hips, but it fit. I slipped on his sunglasses and stepped out onto the deck. The ocean shimmered like glass, and for the first time in years, I took a deep breath that belonged to me. Dinner was a blur of flavors I couldn't pronounce and didn't need to. A woman named Elise brought it to the villa, grilled fish, seasoned rice, and a tart that made my eyes water with sweetness. I ate slowly, deliberately, like I was learning how to taste again. I shared a bite of fish with Henry. He accepted it with more grace than any human I'd met this year. Afterward, I sat by the pool and let my feet dangle in the water. The stars above were so bright they felt like they were staring back. I thought about calling Allison, just to tell her I was safe, just to remind her that I was still her mother. But I didn't. Because the truth was, she hadn't really seen me in years. Not really. I had become a function, an always available resource with a name and a smile, and an unmatched talent for finding lost socks and baking perfect pies. But here, in this villa, in this moment, I wasn't anyone's anything. I was just me, Margaret, a woman with a dog, a story to rewrite, and time. Plenty of time. The phone started ringing at 6:42 a.m. St. Bart's time. Not once, not twice, but 5 times in a row, back to back like a siren wailing from 3,000 miles away. I let it ring, let it echo through the high-ceilinged villa until it faded back into silence. The ocean outside was louder, more patient, less entitled. By the 7th call, I turned the phone off entirely. I wasn't ready. It wasn't that I didn't expect it. I did. I just hadn't realized how quickly panic would replace inconvenience in her voice. Because that's what this was to her. Inconvenient. My absence wasn't heartbreaking. It was disruptive. I had disrupted the sacred, well-oiled machine of her schedule. I had removed a peg from her carefully color-coded life. The babysitter for the dog was no longer cooperating. She'd call it reckless. She'd call it dramatic. But she'd never call it what it was. Overdue. I took my coffee out to the deck. Black, hot, perfect. Henry trotted beside me, tail high, his entire body language suggesting that this was now his estate, and he was merely allowing me to share it. I smiled. My first real smile in days. The sun was already warm against my skin. There were no children screaming, no blenders whirring, no one asking where the Band-Aids were, or if I remembered to sign someone's permission slip. Just water and sky, and the sudden delicious realization that no one knew where I was. At least, not exactly. And then the email came. I hadn't planned to check it, but old habits die hard. Allison's name blinked in bold at the top of the inbox. The subject line was simple. What are you doing? Not a question. A demand. I didn't open it. I couldn't. I knew the words would be laced with that particular tone only daughters can wield. The one they picked up after their first promotion, sharpened through years of managing everything from carpool to corporate budgets. That clipped, confident, condescending voice that turns even gratitude into a bullet point. She would say, I'd scared the kids. That Lila was crying because she thought something had happened to Grandma. That this wasn't responsible. That this was selfish. Selfish. The word hit me like a slap, even though she hadn't even said it yet. Because I knew it was coming. That's the default label for any woman over 60 who dares to make a decision that isn't about service. And maybe I was being selfish. Maybe that was the entire point. I walked to the edge of the deck and looked out over the sea, the horizon stretching far beyond anything I could name. The last time I had stood this still, this alone, this awake, Richard was still alive. He'd always joked that I was the heart of the house, the engine. I kept everything running, everyone fed, every problem soothed. And I had believed him. Not because it was romantic, but because it felt true. But when he died, the engine didn't stop. It was replaced. Quieter. More efficient. And no one asked how I was. They asked if I could still pick up the dry cleaning. The thing about being needed is that no one ever asks what you need. You get praise instead of presence. You get admiration instead of intimacy. And after a while, you start to believe that usefulness is love. That if you stop being helpful, you'll disappear. But I hadn't disappeared. I'd relocated. And now I was here, barefoot in a villa built for someone wealthier, louder, and far less lonely than I'd ever been. I didn't belong, not really. But I wasn't leaving. Not yet. I poured another cup of coffee, put on the white linen cover-up I'd bought on a whim, and took Henry for a walk down to the beach. I didn't check my phone. I didn't open the email. I let the wind pull at my hair and the sand cling to my ankles like memory. Allison would wait. She had to, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't answering anyone. The beach was quiet. Not empty, just quiet in that expensive, reverent way that only places like St. Bart's can afford. Even the waves came in with a kind of restraint, like they knew the people here preferred beauty without noise. Henry trotted beside me, his paws making tiny, perfect prints in the sand. The leash was only for show. He didn't need it. He stayed close, loyal, attentive. Nothing like the people I used to call mine. I tried not to wonder what Allison had written in the email. Tried not to imagine the voicemails stacking up like bricks against a locked door. I told myself she didn't miss me. She missed the role I played, the function I served, the way I made her life easier without ever asking her to return the favor. Still, the ache lived somewhere behind my ribs. It had built a home there years ago. It came and went, but it never really left. Henry nudged my leg with his nose, then plopped down beside me, letting out a sigh so human it made me laugh. I scratched behind his ears. He leaned in. "It's just us now, isn't it?" I whispered. And it was. A shadow moved across the sand. I looked up to see a woman standing a few feet away, early 40s, long dark hair, sunglasses too big for her face. She was holding a coconut drink and wearing a one-piece that looked like it had cost more than my entire luggage. "Sorry," she said, voice clipped but curious. "Are you American?" I nodded slowly. She smiled like she'd just discovered someone else who spoke her native tongue. "Me too. My husband's off windsurfing or networking, or both. I saw you yesterday, on the deck, with the dog." I nodded again. She sat beside me without asking. "Cute dog. Traveling with him?" "Yes." "That's bold," she said, like she meant reckless. I could never travel with mine. Too much responsibility. I looked at her. She was tanned, toned, well-preserved in that glossy magazine kind of way. The kind of woman Allison would have followed on Instagram and quietly resented. "Sometimes responsibility is the best excuse to go," I said. She blinked, then let out a laugh. "That's deep." "Number." It was just honest. She asked where I was staying, how long I'd be here. I gave her half-truths and a smile. She talked about her husband, her kids, the nannies, the way she never got time alone, the way people expected her to just be there, like a given. And I saw it, the faint crack in the middle of her forehead, the weariness behind the practiced smile. She was 20 years younger, but I knew that look. I'd lived in it, dressed in it, served dinner while wearing it. She looked at me again, this time differently. "You know," she said slowly, "I think you might be my hero." I didn't respond, didn't need to. She wasn't saying it for me. She stayed for a few minutes longer, then wandered off, drink in hand, already half forgotten. But her words lingered. A hero. Not a mother. Not a babysitter. Not the woman who always knew where the Scotch tape was. A hero. It made me want to cry. Not because it was true, but because it had never been said. I stayed there until the sun dipped lower in the sky, until the tide reached for my ankles, like it wanted to pull me into something new. And for once, I didn't pull back. The next morning, I turned my phone back on. Not because I was ready, but because I needed to see what war waited on the other side. 17 missed calls, 9 voicemails, 5 text messages, all from Allison, and 1 from her husband, Jeff, which meant things had escalated past irritation into full-blown damage control. The texts read like a slow burn unraveling into panic. "Where are you?" "Mom, this isn't funny." "You took the dog?" "The kids are upset." "We need to talk, immediately." That last one was the most telling. We need to talk. Not, "Are you okay?" Not, I'm sorry if we took you for granted. Just a command. A summoning. As if I were an employee who'd abandoned post. The voicemails were worse. Her voice, so tightly coiled it nearly snapped in the third message. She tried to sound calm, controlled. But I've known that girl since the day she was placed in my arms, purple and screaming. I know what her control sounds like. I know when she's afraid. Not for me. For the optics. By the sixth voicemail, the pretense cracked. You've really embarrassed me, Mom. I mean, what are people supposed to think? There it was. The real concern. Not my safety. Not even Henry. But her reflection in the eyes of others. What are people supposed to think? I stared at the screen for a long time, then walked out onto the villa's sun-drenched terrace and tossed the phone on the lounge chair. Let it sit there like an accusation I refused to answer. Below, Henry was already on patrol, tail wagging as he circled the pool. The staff had started calling him Monsieur Henri. I didn't correct them. He had earned the title. Later that afternoon, Luke, the driver, returned to take me to a nearby market. I wanted to cook. I missed the rhythm of it, the slicing, the simmering, the way the scent of garlic could claim a room. Not because anyone asked me to, but because I wanted to. He asked if I was settling in. I said yes. He asked how long I'd be staying. I didn't answer. The truth was, I didn't know. I walked through the open-air market in sandals and a sundress I hadn't worn in years. Heads turned, not out of recognition, but curiosity. I was older than everyone else by at least 20 years, but for once I didn't shrink because of it. I moved slower, deliberately, like I belonged to the land itself. I picked out tomatoes so ripe they nearly burst in my palm. A wedge of cheese so soft it slouched in its wrapper. A bottle of wine with a label I couldn't read, but which the vendor promised was dangerously lovely. Back at the villa, I poured a glass and turned on music, something French and romantic, the kind of music that fills in all the empty spaces without trying too hard. Henry dozed at the doorway while I chopped onions, the knife tapping rhythmically against the wood. Halfway through making the sauce, I paused. My hands were shaking. Not from age, not from fear, from release. Because it hit me, what I was really doing here. I hadn't just taken the dog and escaped. I had left my life on the table. I had walked away from every version of myself that was polite, convenient, silent. The Margaret who baked for school fundraisers, who sat at the edge of birthday parties waiting to be thanked, who smiled while being spoken over, who never once interrupted. And now, here I was, sautéing onions in the Caribbean with no return ticket and no plan to apologize. The sun dipped below the horizon, bleeding orange and red across the sky like it had something to confess. I sat down to eat, alone, but not lonely. There's a difference. I toasted the air. To the woman I was, I whispered. And then, quieter. To the woman I'm becoming. The morning after my private toast, the guilt tried to creep back in, like smoke under a door. It always does, doesn't it? No matter how far you run, how high you fly, guilt finds you. Especially if you're a mother. Especially if you've ever dared to want something for yourself. I was sitting on the deck in my robe, the coffee in my hand still hot but forgotten. The ocean was still there, vast, forgiving. But my mind wasn't on the waves. It was back in that Seattle kitchen. The one with the fridge magnets shaped like fruit, and the calendar that held everyone's plans but mine. That house had grown quiet after Richard died, but not in a peaceful way. In the kind of quiet that rots. That asks nothing of you except to keep existing. That was the woman I'd become. Existing. Reliable. Predictable. Present. Until I wasn't. I finally listened to the last voicemail, the one she left at midnight. Her voice was small, not angry, just tired. Mom, please just call me back. We're worried. I don't know what you're doing. You've never done something like this before. We don't know how to explain it to the kids. Explain it to the kids. As if it were a scandal. As if my absence required interpretation. I deleted the message. Not out of cruelty, but because it didn't deserve to live rent-free in my peace. Henry looked up from his corner of the deck, sensing the shift in me. He stood, stretched, and wandered over, pressing his head gently into my leg. I ran a hand over his back, grateful he never asked for more than I could give. Loyal. Uncomplicated. The villa phone rang. It startled me. No one had that number, except the concierge and Luke. I answered with caution in my voice. Hello? Ms. Fielding, Luke said, breathless. There is a visitor at the front desk asking for you. She says it is urgent. She has a dog leash in her hand. My blood turned cold. I didn't ask who. I didn't need to. It was Allison. I hung up the phone and sat still for a long moment. A different kind of silence filled the room, thick, expectant. The kind of quiet before a storm breaks over your roof. She had come. Somehow, she had found me. Booked a flight. Crossed an ocean. Not because she missed me. Not even because she wanted to understand. No. Because I had become unpredictable. And unpredictable women terrify people who rely on control. I heard the doorbell chime once, delicate, almost polite. Then again, louder. I opened the door and found her standing on the threshold, sweat on her temples, a tight expression on her face. She was still dressed for the airport, jeans too expensive to wrinkle, blazer too stiff for the heat. I had to book a last-minute flight. It cost a fortune, she said before even saying hello. Her eyes flicked past me into the villa, then down at Henry, then back to my face. I needed space, I said simply. You took the dog. I took myself. Allison stepped inside without being invited. Her presence carried all the cold air of the life I'd left behind. She looked around, at the pool, the view, the bottle of wine still half full from the night before. I don't understand what's happening, she said finally. I know, I replied. That's part of the problem. She sat on the edge of a chair like it might bite her. I stayed standing. I'm your daughter. I'm your mother. The silence stretched, taut and trembling. You could have said something. Told me how you were feeling. I've said a lot of things over the years. You only hear what fits your schedule. She flinched, just slightly, but I saw it. You think I meant to hurt you? She asked, suddenly vulnerable. We've just been busy. That word again. Busy. The universal excuse. I raised you to believe that kindness was duty, I said softly. That was my mistake. I should have taught you that it's a choice. Her face crumpled, not completely, just enough to let the edges show. I didn't reach for her. I wasn't ready. And maybe, neither was she. Allison stayed for 2 days. Not because she wanted to, but because she didn't know what else to do. She had come expecting a scene, a teary apology, maybe a breakdown, the return of the obedient, dependable woman who had always made things easier by disappearing into the background. But instead, she found me. Still. Calm. Not unkind, but unmoved. The villa made her uncomfortable. Too open. Too quiet. She kept looking for things to do, tidying dishes that didn't need it, checking her phone every few minutes, scrolling through emails she wasn't reading. She was trying to anchor herself in the familiar, but this place wouldn't let her. It didn't belong to her version of me. I watched her flail in silence. She cooked once. A salad, barely dressed, made with too much salt and not enough patience. She handed it to me like it was an olive branch, but we both knew it wasn't. It was a performance. I ate it anyway, slowly, wordlessly. The second morning, she followed me down to the beach. I hadn't invited her, but I didn't stop her. Henry ran ahead, as he always did, his tail cutting little arcs through the sand. We walked side by side, our feet sinking into the wet shoreline. I kept my eyes on the water. "You scared me," she said finally, voice low, like she didn't want to wake something that might still be sleeping. I didn't respond right away. "You just left." "I did." She stopped walking. I could feel the heat rolling off her skin. "You took the dog." I turned to look at her then. She was squinting in the sun, arms folded across her chest, shoulders pulled in like she was bracing for a blow. "You always focus on the dog," I said quietly. "What am I supposed to focus on? That you abandoned your family?" The word hit me harder than I expected. Abandoned. I took a step toward her. Not to close the distance, but to see her face clearly. "I didn't abandon anyone. I removed myself. There's a difference." "You didn't say a word." "I didn't think you'd hear it if I had." She looked away, jaw clenched. "You act like we've been cruel to you." "No," I said. "I act like I've been forgotten." Her breath caught, just slightly. "You think I don't see what I've become in your life?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm the emergency contact, the free childcare, the one who always says yes, even when no would have been kinder to herself. I don't blame you for that. I trained you to treat me that way. I said yes too often. I made myself small so you could shine. But I won't apologize for finally wanting something for myself." The waves crept higher, curling around our ankles like they were listening. "I've never seen you like this," she said, almost a whisper. "That's because I've never been like this," I replied. We stood there for a long moment, breathing the same air, but living different realities. Finally, she said, "Lila cried when you didn't answer the phone." "I know," I said, and it hurt more than I wanted to admit. "But maybe one day she'll understand why I had to do it." "She thinks you don't love her anymore." I felt something deep in my chest crack, but it didn't break. It realigned. "Then tell her I love her enough to teach her something her mother never learned." Allison stepped back like I'd slapped her. "She'll grow up thinking love means presence," I continued, "but not submission. Love isn't sacrificing yourself until there's nothing left. It's showing up with your whole self intact. That's what I want her to learn. That's what I should have taught you." She didn't speak again until we were almost back at the villa. "I'm not the villain," she said, eyes fixed straight ahead. "I never said you were," I replied, "but that doesn't make you the hero either." She left the next morning. No dramatic exit, no final confrontation, just a quiet door click and the soft purr of a rented car disappearing down the drive. I stood at the window and watched the clouds shift over the sea. Henry sat by my feet, calm as ever. I had not won. I had not lost. But I had spoken. And for the first time in years, that was enough. After Allison left, the villa felt different. Not emptier, lighter. Like it had exhaled. Like it had been holding its breath alongside me the entire time she was here. I didn't cry. That surprised me. I expected tears, a collapse, the familiar rush of guilt followed by the familiar impulse to fix everything. But there was nothing left to fix. She didn't come to understand. She came to retrieve me, like luggage that had wandered off from baggage claim. And when she realized I wasn't willing to be packed up and rolled home quietly, she left me there, on purpose this time. The sun was high that afternoon, burning through the gauze of clouds that had gathered over the island like watchers. I went into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of the same white wine I'd served the night before. I sipped it slowly, each swallow grounding me deeper into the woman I had become. I liked her. She didn't flinch. Henry lay sprawled on the cool tile, belly up, legs in the air like a question he didn't need answered. I envied his certainty, his total trust in me. It was the kind of love that didn't require proof, or penance, or perfection. I sat down beside him and stroked his fur. For a moment, the only sound was the soft ceiling fan spinning above us and the hum of cicadas outside the open doors. The world wasn't waiting for me to explain myself. It had finally stopped asking questions. And then I heard a knock. Not the hesitant kind either. It was firm. 3 precise raps against the villa's heavy wood frame. I stood slowly, heart tightening. She wouldn't come back this soon. Would she? But when I opened the door, it wasn't Allison. It was a man. Maybe late 50s. Weathered, but handsome in that unbothered way only island locals seem to master. He wore a faded linen shirt, unbuttoned just enough to suggest confidence, and sandals that had clearly walked more than one kind of road. He smiled. Not too wide, not too familiar. "You're the American woman who took the dog and disappeared," he said. I blinked. "I beg your pardon?" He chuckled. "Luke told me. Said he drove a woman here last week who had the kind of silence people carry after explosions. Said she looked like she hadn't breathed in years. Also said she had a dog who refuses to sit in the back seat." "That sounds accurate." "I'm Mark." He extended a hand, and I shook it before I could think better of it. His palm was warm and calloused, like he used it for more than scrolling. "I run the sailing tours near the cove," he continued. "Luke thought you might want to see the island from a different angle." I raised an eyebrow. "Did Luke also mention I just excommunicated my daughter and reclaimed my autonomy on this porch?" Mark laughed. "No, but he said you were interesting. That's rare around here." I studied him for a moment. There was nothing performative in his stance. He wasn't trying to charm me. He wasn't filling silence out of discomfort. He was simply standing in it, unafraid. It felt foreign and dangerously appealing. "I don't really do tours," I said. "Good," he replied. "I don't really give them." He handed me a card anyway. Simple, handwritten, just his name and a number. "Call me," he said, "when you're ready to see something that doesn't ask anything from you." Then he walked away, just like that. I closed the door and leaned against it, pulse flickering like a match struck against dry wood. I hadn't expected him. I hadn't expected anyone. Later that night, I found myself staring at the card. Mark. Not a complicated name. Not a complicated man, if my instincts were right. And God, wasn't that rare? A man who didn't interrupt, who didn't need to take up more space than the room allowed. I didn't call him. Not yet. But I didn't throw the card away either. Instead, I sat on the edge of the pool, legs submerged, glass of wine in hand, and thought about how desire, real desire, doesn't feel like lightning or fire. It feels like possibility, like oxygen after years of breathing through a straw. It had been a week since Allison left. The silence between us had gone from jarring to merciful. There were no more voicemails, no new texts. She'd retreated for now, nursing the wound of losing control, maybe even realizing that she had mistaken obedience for love. Henry didn't care. Henry just wanted his belly rubbed and his breakfast on time. He was, in many ways, the healthiest relationship I'd had in years. And yet, I kept thinking about the man on the porch. Mark. That name sat in the back of my mind like a song you don't remember learning, but somehow know by heart. I hadn't told anyone about him, not even in my journal. Some things are too new to risk defining. On the fourth evening, just as I was folding laundry I didn't need to do, Luke knocked on the kitchen door. Bonsoir, madame. Fielding, he said, with a grin that knew something. I narrowed my eyes. What is it? Mark is sailing at sunset, he said. He asked if I'd pass along the invitation. No pressure. There was pressure, but not the kind that demanded, the kind that reminded you you're still alive. I looked down at my clothes, linen pants, a blouse with a tomato stain on the sleeve, and up at Luke. I'm not dressed for anything. He won't mind. That made it worse. 20 minutes later, I stood at the edge of the dock. The boat was smaller than I expected, sleek, white, patient-looking, like it had all the time in the world. Mark stood at the bow, one hand on a rope, sunglasses tucked into the collar of his shirt. He smiled when he saw me, not like someone impressed, like someone pleased. I wasn't sure you'd come, he said. Neither was I. He offered his hand as I stepped aboard. His palm was just as warm as I remembered. The sail lifted with a quiet grace. We moved, not fast, just enough to feel the sea take us in. For a while we didn't talk, just watched the horizon stretch wider, the water shift from blue to gold. Henry curled up near the helm like this was just another Tuesday. Finally, he broke the silence. You look different today. Wrinkled? I asked. Unburdened. The word lodged in my throat. I didn't know how to respond to it, so I didn't. He nodded toward the island in the distance. There's a cove around that bend. No tourists. Locals only. We could go there. I'm not really dressed for the beach. You're not here to impress anyone. That, somehow, was the most seductive thing I'd heard in years. The sun dipped lower. Orange bled into lavender, the sky painted like a bruise healing backward. I let the wind undo my hair. I let my body lean into the sway of the boat. I let go, just a little. He didn't flirt. Not really. But every glance, every word, every pause felt like the opposite of being dismissed. At one point, he asked, "Were you happy before you came here?" It was a dangerous question. I answered it carefully. I thought I was useful. I mistook that for joy. He nodded, like he'd heard that before, maybe lived it too. When the boat finally returned to dock, the stars were beginning to spill across the sky. I hesitated before stepping off. My hand found his again, not out of need, but out of choice. Thank you, I said. For the boat? For not asking me to explain myself. Mark smiled, but it was sad. People don't usually explain when they're drowning. They just go quiet. I looked at him, startled. He held my gaze. I was quiet for a long time, I said. And now? He asked. I'm learning how to make noise. He nodded once. Not approval, recognition. I walked back to the villa under a sky so bright it made me ache. Henry padded beside me, content, unquestioning. At the door, I turned back once. Mark was still at the dock, watching the sea. Or maybe he was watching me. Either way, I didn't feel invisible. And I didn't feel guilty. I felt seen. And after a lifetime of being useful, that felt dangerously close to being loved. The next morning, I woke up before the sun. Not out of habit, but out of something else. Something closer to anticipation than obligation. I made coffee in the quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't ask for anything. The sky was still inked in navy, the first hint of orange curling at the edge, like a secret being whispered into the world. Henry yawned and stretched beside the glass doors, already watching the horizon. Dogs know. They always know when something has shifted, even if they don't name it. I hadn't dreamt of Richard in weeks. For years he'd shown up nightly, sometimes smiling, sometimes silent, but always there, lingering just behind my shoulder like a shadow I hadn't asked for. But lately, it was as if he'd stepped back, given me space. Not in resentment, in understanding. As though even he knew it was time for me to live a chapter that wasn't footnoted by his absence. I sat on the terrace with my coffee and stared at the sea, my thoughts slow, deliberate. I thought about Mark, his hands, his patience, the way he didn't treat silence like something to be filled. He hadn't called since the sale, hadn't texted, no messages, no pressure. And somehow that made me want to see him more. It's a strange thing to be seen without being summoned, to be wanted without being needed. When you spend your life giving, your time, your body, your approval, you forget how to receive without suspicion. You forget what it's like to be offered something with no strings and no ledger waiting to be balanced. And then someone shows up, hands open, eyes steady, and says, "You don't owe me anything." You almost don't know what to do with that. By noon, I was restless, not anxious, just restless in that way you get when you've been quiet for so long it starts to echo. I pulled out the journal and wrote for hours, pages of things I didn't know I'd been holding. Regrets, tiny betrayals. The day Allison told me I was being overprotective for worrying too much about Lila's fever. The night Jeff made a joke about Mom's memory slipping, and everyone laughed, and I laughed too, because what else was I supposed to do? I wrote about the way Richard used to leave for thinking walks that lasted exactly until dinner was served. How I used to time my pain, suppressing tears to match the schedule of someone else's comfort. And then I wrote something I had never dared to put in ink. I am still angry at being forgotten while I was still in the room. The page stared back, accusing and holy. I didn't tear it out. I let it stay. That night, Mark called. His voice was soft, like dusk. "I'm making dinner," he said. "Fish, vegetables I barely know how to pronounce, nothing fancy." I didn't hesitate. "I'll bring the wine." His place wasn't far, tucked away in a cove where the road turned to gravel and the trees grew wild. It wasn't a villa, it was a home. With chipped dishes and books stacked in corners, and music playing from a speaker so old it crackled at the high notes. He opened the door barefoot, a towel over his shoulder, and smiled like he'd been expecting me his whole life. "You showed up," he said. "I do that sometimes." Dinner was simple, delicious. We ate on the porch by candlelight, the air thick with salt and something unspoken. Halfway through the meal, he looked at me and asked, "What's the hardest thing you've ever done?" I didn't think. I answered. "Stay," I said. "I stayed in places long after I knew I should have left." He nodded. Not in pity, in recognition. "And you?" I asked. "Leave," he said. "I left when I should have stayed." We sat in that fragile space, both of us holding old scars like heirlooms, not polishing them, just acknowledging they were real. After dinner, we didn't touch. We didn't need to. There was no grab, no conquest, just the comfort of sharing oxygen with someone who wasn't trying to own it. Before I left, he walked me to my car. The moon was high, full, impossible to ignore. "Margaret," he said, "you don't have to be anything here. Not strong, not kind, not even healed." I looked at him, eyes burning. What if I don't know who I am without all that? "Then maybe," he said, "that's who you're about to meet." The engine started. The gravel shifted beneath my tires. And for the first time in years, I drove away without feeling like I was leaving anything behind. The night after dinner with Mark, I didn't sleep. Not because of nerves, or guilt, or any familiar ghost tugging at the hem of my peace, but because I didn't want to close my eyes. Something had shifted, and I was afraid if I slept, I'd wake to find it gone. So I sat up in bed, legs crossed beneath the old quilt I'd pulled from the closet, soft, worn, smelling faintly of lavender and salt. Henry snored gently at the foot, his tiny chest rising and falling in rhythm with the waves outside. The moonlight sliced through the shutters, casting long shadows across the floor, and I just sat there, awake in a way I hadn't been in decades, fully present, no roles to play, no one waiting on me, no guilt asking to be folded and tucked into every decision like a handkerchief in a coat pocket. Mark hadn't touched me, and yet, something about his hands lingered. There's a certain intimacy and restraint, the kind that makes your breath slow, not quicken, the kind that makes you want to linger instead of rush. I found myself remembering things. Not memories. I've had plenty of those. This was different. It was like fragments of me returning from exile. The me who once danced barefoot in the kitchen at midnight, just because the radio played her favorite song. The me who wrote poetry no one ever saw. The me who used to sing in the car without worrying if the window was down. That woman had been quiet for so long. Not dead. Just buried. I pressed my hand to my chest and whispered, "I remember you." The next morning, I went down to the beach before the sun was up. Just me and Henry, the sky still blue-black, the sand cool and undisturbed. I stood at the edge of the water, let the tide kiss my toes, and made a promise I hadn't realized I was aching to speak. No more vanishing. It wasn't a vow to anyone else, just to me. Because the truth is, I had spent years erasing myself in increments. Not because anyone asked me to, at least not directly, but because it was easier than explaining why I wanted to be seen. When you're a woman, especially an older woman, the world applauds your silence, your adaptability, your ability to endure with grace. You become praised for how well you disappear. But what they never tell you is that one day you'll look in the mirror and wonder whose eyes are staring back. I wasn't wondering anymore. That afternoon, I went into town and bought a bright red dress. Linen. Simple. But bolder than anything I'd worn in years. It was the kind of red that says, "I didn't come here to fade." The saleswoman smiled as I slipped it over my shoulders in the fitting room. "C'est magnifique," she said softly, like I'd put on more than fabric. Like I'd put on fire. I wore it that evening. No occasion, no reservation. Just me, a table at a quiet cafe by the water, and a glass of rosé chilled to perfection. Mark walked by. I hadn't planned to see him. I certainly hadn't told him I'd be there. But he stopped when he saw me. Froze, actually. Like the air between us had thickened. He didn't say anything at first. Just took me in with those impossibly patient eyes. "You changed something," he finally said. "Yes," I replied. I started telling the truth. He didn't ask what kind. He pulled out the chair across from me, slow and deliberate, and sat down like a man who knew he'd just witnessed something sacred. We didn't talk about Allison, or the villa, or the life I'd left behind like a burned-out shell. We talked about books, and jazz, and whether freedom always feels this lonely in the beginning. He told me he'd left Paris 10 years ago after his father died and his marriage collapsed. That he came to the island thinking he'd stay 6 months. He never left. "I wanted to stop explaining my pain," he said. "Here, I didn't have to." I nodded. I understood that. Too well. When the check came, he didn't reach for it, and neither did I. We split it. Not because we were modern or fair or stubborn, because it wasn't a date. It was something quieter, older, a recognition. He walked me home. Not all the way to the villa, just to the start of the gravel path, where the streetlights ended and the stars began. He didn't try to kiss me. He just looked at me, standing there in my red dress, and said, "You don't owe anyone your quiet anymore." I watched him walk away under the moonlight. And I didn't feel alone. I felt real. It rained the next morning. Not a drizzle. Not the kind of tropical mist that dances politely across windows. This was a storm. The sky cracked itself open and spilled. Thunder growled low and long, like the earth itself had something to say. I watched it from the terrace, wrapped in a blanket, Henry curled at my feet. The villa was dim, all natural light drowned in the gray. No music, no movement. Just me, the storm, and the thrum of something deep inside that refused to be drowned out. Storms do that. They clear. They confront. They shake things loose that were clinging too long to the wrong places. I didn't make coffee. I just sat. Listened. Let the rain hit the tile roof like a truth I hadn't said aloud yet. I kept thinking about Mark's words. You don't owe anyone your quiet anymore. I didn't realize until then how much of my silence had been inherited. From my mother. And hers before her. Generations of women who believed dignity was synonymous with disappearance. Who carried pain in their posture and pride in their ability to never name it. My mother was good at that when it got too unruly. I used to watch her move through our small house like a ghost who cleaned up after the living. Her hands always busy. Her mouth always closed. Except for Sundays at church, when she'd sing hymns like she believed her own voice didn't belong to her the rest of the week. I learned early that there was power in being needed, and danger in being visible. I followed that script perfectly. Until now. By late afternoon, the rain softened. The sky peeled itself back into layers, first bruised violet, then pink, then gold. The kind of gold that doesn't feel real. The kind of gold that makes everything under it look holy, even the ruins. I stepped outside. The stones were still wet, slick beneath my bare feet, but I walked anyway. I walked to the edge of the property where the wild bushes met the cliff, and I screamed. Not loud, not long. Just enough to hear myself. To make a sound that had no purpose except to prove I still could. Then I laughed. It startled Henry. He tilted his head and looked at me like I'd finally lost it. Maybe I had. Or maybe, for the first time in my life, I'd found it. My voice unhooked from duty. My laughter untethered from politeness. That evening, I cooked. Really cooked. Not for company. Not for the kids. Not to impress or apologize or fill silence with usefulness. I cooked because I missed the way garlic clings to your skin, the way wine sizzles when it hits the pan. I cooked because my hands wanted to create something that didn't beg to be validated. Roasted chicken with lemon and rosemary. A dish I hadn't made since before Richard died. He used to say it was the one thing I cooked that made him feel like we were still in love. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat outside, the plate warm in my lap, the last light of day stretched thin across the sea. And that's when the message came. Not from Allison. From Lila. A text, short, shaky in its punctuation, the kind of message only a child could send and still cut deep. Grandma, are you mad at us? I put the plate down. My hands shook. Not violently. Just enough to feel the blood moving. Just enough to know I was still human, even under all this new skin I was growing. She hadn't said, "Are you okay?" She hadn't said, "I miss you." She asked if I was mad, because that's how children interpret absence, as punishment. And God help me. For a split second, I wanted to pick up the phone and call. I wanted to explain, to soothe, to say, "No, sweetheart, of course not," and wrap my voice around her like I used to when she was sick and couldn't sleep. But I didn't. I texted back, "No, baby, I'm not mad. I just needed to remember who I am. I love you always." She responded instantly. "Okay. When you remember, can you come home?" I stared at the screen until it blurred. Because how do you explain to a child that home isn't always a place with walls? That sometimes home is the silence you finally made peace with. That sometimes it's a rented villa on a cliff in a red dress you bought to spite your own invisibility. I didn't answer. Not yet. I finished my wine. I let Henry curl up in my lap. And I sat there as the sky grew darker, knowing that love wasn't always in the going back. Sometimes it lived in the staying gone. The next morning, I made the bed with care. Not out of habit, but reverence. Every fold in the blanket, every pillow fluffed just so, it felt like an act of choosing. Choosing stillness. Choosing space. Choosing this day, this version of myself, and whatever came with her. I moved slowly, not because I was tired, but because I was finally allowed to be deliberate. After years of rushing to meet someone else's clock, I'd forgotten that time could belong to me. The message from Lila still lived in the corner of my mind, soft and tender like a bruise that hadn't darkened yet. When you remember, can you come home? I wanted to tell her I was already home, that I hadn't left love, only the place where love had stopped feeling like kindness and started feeling like expectation. But how do you explain that to a child? How do you explain to someone still learning the shape of their own shadow that sometimes love must stretch itself across an ocean before it feels whole again? I made tea and stepped out onto the terrace. The sun was gentle, the sky full of promise but not pressure. Henry lay on his side, belly to the breeze, the kind of relaxation only a dog or a woman freshly freed can know. My phone buzzed. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. The silence had become a kind of sanctuary. But I reached for it anyway, because curiosity and healing are not enemies, they just need boundaries. It wasn't Allison. It was March. Boats going out at dusk. I'll bring bread and you bring the sky. If not today, some other tomorrow. I didn't smile, not with my mouth. But something in me lifted, like a curtain pulled back to let light in. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I closed the phone and walked down to the beach barefoot, sand sticking to the arches of my feet like a reminder. I'm still here. I exist. The tide was low. The water kissed the shore like it remembered every version of me that had walked here since I'd arrived. The woman who came to hide. The woman who stayed to remember. And now, maybe, the woman who might learn how to begin again. I sat where the wet sand met the dry, pulled my knees to my chest, and let the sun crawl up my spine. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I didn't brace. And in that stillness, a thought rose. You don't need to go back to prove you love them. That was always the lie. That motherhood meant martyrdom. That distance was cruelty. That loving your family meant being endlessly available to them, even at the cost of yourself. But what if love wasn't sacrifice? What if love was boundary? What if love was saying, I am still worthy, even when I'm not fixing your mess, soothing your guilt, or holding your fear so you don't have to feel it yourself? I stood, brushed the sand off my legs, and began walking back. Slowly, quietly, with the kind of gravity that only comes from being whole. By the time I reached the villa, I had made my decision. I called Mark. He answered on the first ring. I'd like to bring more than just the sky, I said. Do you like lemon tarts? His chuckle traveled through the phone like a secret. Dangerously. Then I'll see you at dusk. I baked that afternoon. Not like I used to, rushed, distracted, trying to prove something. I baked slowly. Flour dusted the counters. The lemon curd was thick, glossy, exactly as I remembered from a cookbook I hadn't opened in 20 years. I plated 2 generous slices, wrapped them in parchment, and placed them in the basket alongside a linen napkin and 2 forks. As the sun dipped low and the world turned golden again, I walked down to the dock, Henry in tow, basket in hand, red dress on. Mark was already there, barefoot, smiling, waiting. He reached for my basket like it was an offering. I looked at him and saw not a man who came to save me, but one who simply stayed. And sometimes, that's the greater miracle. No rescue, no fixing, just a witness. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a woman recovering from being broken. I felt like a woman becoming something unbreakable. The water was calm that evening, unusually so. The kind of calm that makes you think something underneath it is holding its breath. Mark steered us out of the harbor with a quiet competence, one hand on the tiller, the other resting loosely on his thigh. I sat beside him on the bench, the basket between us, the lemon tart wrapped like a promise neither of us was quite ready to unwrap. Henry curled at my feet, nose tucked beneath his paw, already lulled by the motion of the boat and the scent of salt. The sky was molten, deep orange bruising into violet, the last of the sun dripping into the sea like honey. It wasn't beautiful in the way paintings are beautiful. It was beautiful in the way truth is, undeniable, raw, and oddly comforting. We didn't speak for a long while. Mark glanced at me, his eyes squinting just slightly, not from scrutiny, but from the dying light. "You're quiet tonight." I took a breath, not to answer, but to steady myself. "I've spent so much of my life filling silences I didn't create," I said finally. "I'm learning how to sit in one without trying to patch it." He nodded once, like a man who knew exactly what that cost. "You don't need to patch anything here," he said, his voice low, the kind that vibrates more than it echoes. I looked out at the open sea. "That's what scares me." "Why?" "Because I don't know who I am when I'm not useful." He didn't answer immediately, just adjusted the sail, letting the wind take more of the weight. When he did speak, it was quiet, not hesitant, but deliberate. "You're not here because you're useful," he said. "You're here because you are." I let that sit. I didn't push it away, didn't question it. I just let it land, soft and heavy, like a coat I hadn't realized I was cold without. We drifted for a while longer, the island growing small behind us, the ocean swallowing everything else. I reached into the basket and pulled out the tart. He grinned like a child who'd just been handed a forbidden sweet. I handed him a fork and kept one for myself, and we ate straight from the parchment, the citrus cutting through the warm, salt-heavy air like a blade made of sunlight. When he finished his last bite, Mark leaned back, resting his arm on the edge of the boat, and turned toward me. "Do you miss them?" he asked. The question hit like a wave I didn't see coming. "I miss the idea of them," I said, the version of us I carried around in my head. But the real thing? The constant reaching, the unspoken expectation that I should always say yes, always absorb, never ask? Number, I don't miss that. "And your granddaughter?" I looked down at Henry. His ear twitched, as if he too was waiting for my answer. "I love her more than anything," I said. "But love isn't enough if you're expected to disappear to prove it." Mark was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Have you ever told her that?" "No," I said, "because she's still young enough to believe love and availability are the same thing. I'd rather be gone for a while and show her what a whole woman looks like when she's grown than stay and teach her how to be invisible." He looked at me like I'd just said something sacred. "You're brave," he said. "No," I replied. "I'm just tired of being afraid." The sun finally disappeared, the horizon swallowing it whole. Mark lit a small lantern and hung it from the beam above us, its glow soft and golden, casting our faces in a kind of quiet reverence. We sat in that light, in that boat, in that moment. There were no declarations, no plans, no illusions of forever. Just two people choosing for one evening to witness each other without trying to change the view. And for me, that was more than enough. Because love, I was learning, didn't always arrive in grand gestures. Sometimes it came like this, unexpected, uncomplicated, and impossible to ignore. And in that stillness, with the wind behind us and nothing but dark water ahead, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Not hope. Something quieter, deeper. Permission. The following morning, the sea still hummed in my bones. That's what the quiet does, when you finally let it in. It doesn't shout. It lingers. It stays in your bloodstream, moves through you like something cellular, permanent. I woke up feeling both lighter and heavier at once, like a part of me had finally been named, while another part quietly slipped away in the night. I didn't dream. I just was. The sheets were cool against my skin, the sun not quite yet risen. For a moment, I didn't move. I just listened. To the faint sound of waves lapping the shore, to the rustle of Henry stretching at the foot of the bed, to the silence inside my own head, which, miracle of miracles, wasn't crowded with anyone else's needs. I rose slowly, wrapped myself in the soft robe hanging behind the door, and padded barefoot into the kitchen. I didn't bother turning on the lights. The darkness was gentle now, not threatening. I liked it. It asked nothing of me. The kettle hissed to life as I stood at the window. Beyond the glass, the sky was a bruise slowly healing, deep purple fading into gold. Another day had found me. I had stopped chasing them, and now they came on their own. I drank my tea on the terrace, legs tucked beneath me, Henry curled like punctuation at my side. I thought of Mark, of the way he had looked at me, not with hunger, not with pity, but with a kind of steady curiosity. Like he wasn't trying to possess the moment, only witness it. I didn't know what we were. And for once, I didn't need to define it. There's a freedom in letting something live in the space between words. A freedom I had never known in my life back in Seattle, where everything had to be accounted for, labeled, scheduled, color-coded into something manageable. But you cannot schedule healing. And you certainly cannot schedule a woman remembering who the hell she is. I glanced at my phone. Still no new messages from Allison. But the text from Lila remained at the top of the screen, like a note tacked to a door I wasn't ready to open. When you remember, can you come home? There it was again. That soft ache. The pull of family, tangled with expectation, woven through with love and the burden of it. It hurt in the way old scars hurt during rain, deep, familiar, and without apology. I set the phone down. Not because I was ignoring her, but because I wasn't ready to give her half of me again. When I came back to her, and I would come back, it would be as someone whole. Not as a shadow of her grandmother, not as her mother's extension, but as Margaret. And I hadn't quite finished becoming her yet. Later that day, I walked into town. The market was humming with weekend noise, voices layered on top of each other, vendors shouting in French, the smell of citrus and sun-warmed cheese wrapping around me like a memory from a life I'd never lived, but somehow knew by heart. I bought strawberries, fresh, bursting red, a bottle of olive oil so golden it looked holy, a baguette that was still warm, tucked under my arm like a secret. I didn't rush. I didn't plan. I let myself wander. It felt indulgent and necessary. I passed a bookstore with its doors open and stepped inside without thinking. Rows of paper. The kind of silence that isn't empty, but sacred. A woman with gray-streaked hair looked up from behind the counter, smiled, and returned to her book. No greeting, no sales pitch. Just space. I found a volume of poetry, French and English side by side. Rilke. I hadn't read him in years. I flipped to a page at random. You must give birth to your images. They are the future waiting to be born. I sat down in the corner of the shop and cried quietly into the spine. Not because I was sad, but because I had finally stopped running. And what was left in me, when the running was done, was worthy of being seen. I bought the book, walked out into the light, returned to the villa, cooked dinner with my hands, my heart, and no distractions. Lit a candle, sat alone, ate slowly, Henry at my feet, music low. I didn't check my phone. I didn't reach for anyone. Because for the first time in a very, very long time, I wasn't lonely. I was enough. It happened while I was watering the basil. I had taken to keeping a small pot of it just outside the kitchen door, next to the rosemary and the fading bougainvillea. It had become part of my morning ritual. Warm water in a chipped ceramic jug, bare feet on the tile, the scent of the island waking up with me. I bent down to check the leaves, still damp from the night air, when the phone rang. Not a buzz, not a notification. A full ring. A call. It was Allison. The name on the screen sat there like a ghost at the table. I stared at it for a long time, the jug in my hand, water dripping steadily down my wrist. Part of me wanted to let it ring out, not to punish her, but to protect myself. I had gone so long without hearing her voice, I wasn't sure I could bear the sound of it threaded with guilt, or worse, righteousness. But I answered. There was a pause before she spoke, like she dialed and then regretted it, but the line had already connected. "Hi," she said. Her voice was careful, as though she were holding something fragile in her throat. "Hi," I answered. Silence again. Not the easy kind I'd come to love, but the tense, trembling kind. The kind where every breath feels like the floor creaking before it gives way. "I heard from the neighbors," she said. "You're still in St. Barts." I said nothing. She cleared her throat. "Lila's birthday is next month." I could hear it, the implication beneath the words. "Will you be back by then?" "I know," I said quietly. "She's been asking about you." I closed my eyes. Of course she had. Children have the cruelest kind of loyalty. Pure, unflinching. They remember you at your best, even when you vanish. "I told her you're taking time for yourself," Allison continued, her voice a little tighter now. "That sometimes grown-ups need to recalibrate." "Did you believe it when you said it?" I asked. There was a pause, a breath. Then, "I don't know. I'm trying." That was something. Not an apology, but not a deflection either. She was trying. For Allison, that was a quiet miracle. "I'm not staying forever," I said. "But you're not rushing back either." "No." I could almost hear her nodding on the other end. Then her voice softened in a way I hadn't heard since she was a teenager, when she used to come into the kitchen late at night and sit at the counter, waiting for me to ask what was wrong. "I've been angry," she said. "Really angry. That you left. That you didn't ask. That you took Henry and just disappeared." "I know. But I've also been thinking." She took a shaky breath. "About how I never really asked how you were doing. Not since Dad died. Maybe not even before that." "You were busy," I said. "With the girls. With life." "That's not an excuse." "No," I said, "but it's a reason. And I understand reasons." More silence. But this one felt different. Less like a fracture. More like a bridge. "I don't want to be like this with you," she said. "I don't want Lila to learn that silence is how women survive." That made my chest tighten. "I don't want that either." "I thought being strong meant doing everything," she whispered. "Now I think maybe it means knowing when to stop." Tears welled up, sudden and hot. I didn't wipe them away. "I'm not mad that you left, Mom. I think I was scared." "Scared of what?" "That you wouldn't come back." I let that sit for a moment, because it deserved to hang in the air. I had to leave, I said, because I was losing myself, and I couldn't teach you or Lila how to love a woman who disappears for everyone else. There was a long pause. Then quietly, "Will you come for her birthday?" "Yes," I said, "but not to perform, not to be the help, just as myself." "As Grandma," she said, the smile audible in her voice now. "No," I corrected gently, "as Margaret, who also happens to be Grandma." She laughed. It cracked a little, like something old breaking open. When we hung up, I sat there for a long time with the phone in my lap and the basil still waiting to be watered. The sun was higher now, stretching gold across the kitchen tiles. Henry came to sit beside me, pressing his warm body against my leg. I scratched behind his ear, and he let out a contented sigh. I was going home, but not back. There's a difference. Because this time, I wasn't returning to my old life. I was bringing a new woman with me, one who knew the worth of her silence, one who understood the weight of her name, one who had looked at the sea and said, "I am not done yet." And that made all the difference. The plane touched down just after dusk, the sky over Seattle bruised in shades of deep gray and tired blue. I watched the city lights flicker through the small oval window, familiar roads and rooftops unfolding beneath us like a memory retold too many times to feel real. The runway rushed toward us. Then wheels touched earth. The body jolted forward. The moment snapped back into place. I was home, but not the woman who left. I could feel it in my bones, in the steadiness of my hands, in the breath I took as the cabin lights flickered on and the seatbelt signs chimed. I moved slower, but with purpose. I didn't flinch. Not even when the woman in the row behind me called someone to say she'd landed and would still make it to dinner. I didn't race to disembark. I wasn't hurrying toward anyone. I wasn't being summoned. Henry poked his nose out of the carrier at my feet, tail wagging softly, eyes bright. He had flown like a champion, like he belonged everywhere. Maybe he did. Maybe I did too. Allison had offered to pick me up. The gesture surprised me. Her voice, when she asked, had been hesitant, not assuming, the way a child might ask to hold something they know they've broken once before. I said yes, not because I needed the ride, but because I needed to see if we could sit side by side without the weight of everything unsaid, crushing the air between us. She was waiting in the arrivals lane, engine running, windows up, a blue scarf knotted at her neck in a way that made her look more polished than she probably felt. I recognized that particular kind of presentation, the armor of effort, the trembling undercurrent. I approached the car slowly. She got out, walked around to open the back door, bent down to greet Henry with an awkwardness I didn't blame her for. He licked her hand once, then turned back to me, tail wagging harder now that the pieces of his pack were realigning. "You look," she started, then faltered. "Different." "I feel different." She nodded, like she didn't know what to do with that. Then she took a breath. "You look good," she tried again. "Rested." "Thank you." We stood in silence for a moment. Then she moved aside to let me in. The drive home was quiet. Not tense, not quite comfortable. Just cautious. Like two people learning to breathe in the same room again. The city blurred past the window, blocky shapes of apartments and coffee shops, street lamps glowing through the early evening haze. Rain tapped against the windshield, soft but steady, a kind of Seattle lullaby I hadn't realized I missed. "You're staying at the house?" she asked. "For a few days, then I'll figure it out." She nodded, hands tightening slightly on the steering wheel. "I didn't change anything," she said. "Your room's the same." I didn't answer right away. "That's kind," I said eventually. But it's not my room anymore. It's just a space I used to live in. She turned to look at me at a red light, something fragile and searching in her expression. Do you regret it? She asked. Leaving? She nodded. No, I said. Not even for a second. She didn't ask me to explain, and I didn't offer. When we pulled into the driveway, the porch light was on. The house looked smaller than I remembered, quieter. The yard was tidy. Someone had trimmed the hedges and swept the walkway. I wondered if she'd done it out of habit or guilt. I stepped out of the car slowly, Henry trotting ahead of me like he knew where he was going. Allison followed, holding the door open like it was something sacred. Inside, everything was as I had left it. The same hallway table with the small bowl of keys. The framed photo of Richard and me from our 25th anniversary, taken at the lake house, his hand on my shoulder, both of us squinting into the sun. The smell of lemon cleaner and something else, lavender maybe, or nostalgia. I stood in the entryway, letting the walls greet me, not welcome me back, just acknowledge me. Tea? She asked. Sure. We moved into the kitchen. She busied herself with the kettle, her movements stiff, overly precise. I sat at the table, fingers lightly tracing the edge of the placemat. Everything had been wiped clean, even the silence. She placed a mug in front of me, then sat across the table. There were 1,000 things we could have said. Apologies, explanations, small talk to paper over the cracks. But none of it would have mattered if we weren't ready to hear each other. So instead, she said, she made you a card. And she slid it across the table like a peace offering. It was pink construction paper folded unevenly in half. Crayon hearts on the cover. Inside, in crooked block letters, I miss you. I love you. Come back when you feel happy again. Zrania Lila. I pressed my hand over the words, felt them pulse under my palm. She didn't mean it as pressure, Allison said quickly. She just loves you. I know, I said. I folded the card and slipped it into my bag. I stayed for 2 nights. The first night, I lay in the old bed and listened to the house breathe. It was strange, being surrounded by everything I once called mine and not feeling possessed by it. It didn't feel like a home I had outgrown. It felt like a life I had completed. On the second day, I sat in the garden with Lila. We picked the last of the summer marigolds. She didn't ask why I left. She didn't ask if I was back for good. She just sat beside me, her small fingers sticky with orange petals, her presence free of questions. That was enough. That night, I told Allison I'd be moving into a small rental on the coast, just a little house near the water, close enough to visit, far enough to be mine. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She just nodded, and for the first time, I believed she understood. When I hugged her goodbye, she held me tighter than I expected. And when she whispered, "I'm glad you left," I closed my eyes. Because that was it. That was everything. I drove away early the next morning. Not back to the villa, not back to the woman I used to be, but forward, into something new. The road was quiet. The world, still wrapped in early light, looked different now, like it had made room for me again. And I realized I hadn't come full circle. I'd drawn a new one, with my own hands, on my own terms, not closed, but open. Always open. I wake up to the sound of waves now. Not sirens, not schedules, not someone else's footsteps moving through the kitchen, needing things I'd already given away. The little house on the coast isn't much, but it's mine. The kind of place where nothing expects too much from you. The floors creak. The windows whistle when it rains. The stove needs coaxing, but it fits. Like a dress I never thought I'd wear again. And then one day, I put it on, and remembered how good it felt to take up space. Henry still follows me from room to room like he's worried I might vanish again. Sometimes, I think he understands more than anyone else ever could. He sleeps beside the fireplace now, warm and soft, and sure that I won't leave without him. Lila writes letters, real ones, folded, sealed, stamped. I keep them in a drawer by the bed, read them slowly, one at a time. She doesn't ask me to come back anymore. She just tells me stories. That's all either of us ever needed. To be seen, without being summoned. Allison and I are learning each other again. Without scripts, without roles. Just two women who once mistook love for obedience, and are now trying something quieter, braver, honesty. There are days when the old guilt creeps in. It wears different masks now. The, you should call more mask. The, what if they need you, mask. But I know what those are. I name them. And then I let them pass, like clouds. I don't anchor myself to storms. I walk every morning, down the same path, to the same stretch of sand, and I sit. Just sit. No phone, no clock. Just me. I used to believe growing older meant fading. Now I know it means unfolding. I am not less than I was. I am more. Because I left. Because I stayed gone long enough to remember who I was before the world asked me to be smaller. I still love them. But I love myself now too. And that's not selfish. That's survival. I am no longer waiting to be chosen. I already picked myself. Thank you for being here. Her journey was heavy, but it led her back to herself. Watch another powerful story by clicking on the left, and don't forget to subscribe for more voices that deserve to be heard.